At midnight, on April 28, 1938, 4 towns in Massachusetts stopped existing. Not gradually. Not by accident. By legal decree. Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott were disincorporated in a single stroke of the pen. Their names were struck from the map. Their governments dissolved. Their land handed over to their neighbors. And within a few years, most of what remained of them would sit at the bottom of a reservoir. Here's the strange part. Before the water came, state surveyors walked every road in those towns. They measured every fence line, every barn, every front step. They wrote down who owned what, right down to the stone walls between properties. Not because anyone cared about preserving these towns. They cared about paying for them. Every acre had to be valued before it could be legally drowned. And so, in the process of erasing 4 towns from existence, the state of Massachusetts accidentally created the most detailed record of those towns that has ever existed. That contradiction is the whole story. The very documents built to make a place disappear are often the only reason we can still find it. There's actually a name for the discipline built around this idea now. Historical Geospatial Information Systems, or HGIS for short. Researchers who spend entire careers layering old paper maps onto modern digital ones, treating a 200-year-old field note with the same rigor. A detective might treat a fingerprint. This didn't just happen once. It happened in Tennessee, where a dam swallowed a trading town along with the graves of over 5,000 people. It happened in Pennsylvania, where the government broke a 200-year-old treaty in writing, then drowned the land it had promised to protect. And it happened on the Mississippi River, where nobody made a decision at all. A single flood in 1881 simply moved the river itself and swallowed the first capital of Illinois whole. A reservoir, a dam, a broken treaty, a river that changed its mind, and, strangest of all, a town that came back. One of those disappearances was planned for over a decade. One kept its promise for 150 years, right up until the moment it didn't. One happened because a city needed water. One happened because nobody was watching a riverbank closely enough. And one, decades after everyone assumed it was gone for good, simply rose back out of the water on its own. 5 different endings. But every single one of them left the exact same kind of clue behind. A map, a survey, a field note, a property plat, documents made for taxation, for compensation, for engineering, for legal title. Nobody drew these maps to remember a place. They drew them to divide it, price it, or erase it. And that's exactly why they've become so valuable now. Because buried in the technical language of section lines and acreage totals is something the surveyors never intended to leave behind. A snapshot of a world in the last moment before it was gone. Historians and archaeologists now spend years combing through boxes of brittle paper that were never meant to survive this long. They overlay 19th century plats onto modern satellite images, matching a hand-drawn property corner to a single pixel of open water or forest. They cross-reference century-old field notes with LiDAR scans that can see through forest canopy to the ground beneath, hunting for the faint rectangular outline of a foundation nobody has seen above ground in 100 years. That's not the strangest thing these maps ever preserved, either. If stories like this, the ones hiding in plain sight, filed away in paperwork nobody thought to call history, are the kind of thing you want more of, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe, and let's keep going. Because to understand how maps built for conquest and compensation ended up rescuing the very things they were meant to erase, you have to go back to where this all started. And it starts with an idea that sounds almost too simple to cause this much damage. Imagine being told your family's land no longer exists. Not because it burned, not because it flooded, not because anyone took it away by force, because someone, in an office hundreds of miles away, drew a grid across it. In 1785, the young United States government had a problem. It had land, an almost incomprehensible amount of it. And it needed to turn that land into revenue and farms as fast and as cleanly as possible. The solution was the Land Ordinance of 1785, which created the Public Land Survey System, a project that would eventually rank among the largest cartographic undertakings ever carried out by any government on Earth. The idea was brutally simple. Take the land north and west of the Ohio River and carve it into a grid of perfect 1-mile squares. No curves, no natural boundaries, just numbers and lines. The agency built to carry this out was the General Land Office, created in 1812. Its surveyors fanned out ahead of settlement for nearly 100 years, chains and compasses in hand, measuring a continent 1 square mile at a time. In 1849, the office itself shifted out of the Treasury Department and into the newly created Department of the Interior, a sign of just how enormous the job of managing public land had become. If you've ever driven through the Midwest and wondered why the roads run perfectly straight for hundreds of miles, why farms line up in exact rectangles instead of following the shape of the land itself, that grid is why. It's still under your tires today. Here's what almost nobody expects. At first, the notes these surveyors left behind looked like meaningless technical clutter. At every section corner, a surveyor would mark a nearby tree as a fixed reference point, a witness tree, and jot down its species and size so the boundary could always be relocated later. Nobody thought this mattered beyond the property line. Then, 2 centuries later, ecologists started reading those notes differently. In one region of southern Indiana, surveyors logged more than 32,000 of these witness trees between 1803 and 1820, representing 98 different species. Beech, most often, over 7,000 instances, a species that only dominates where the soil is deep, moist, and largely undisturbed. White oak, close behind it, thriving on well-drained slopes. Sugar maple, so sensitive to fire and logging that its heavy presence meant the ground beneath it had gone a long time without either. Hickory, black oak, tougher, clustered on the drier ridgelines. Those numbers, and thousands like them across the Midwest, let ecologists rebuild an entire forest that no longer existed. A forest wiped out decades later by logging and farming, the surveyors themselves could never have predicted. A boundary marker turned into the only surviving map of a lost ecosystem. Ecologists can now point to a single line in a 200-year-old field book and say, with confidence, that exact spot was old-growth beech forest, untouched, before anyone ever picked up an axe. Those same field notes captured something else. Nobody expected to find hiding in a property record. The earliest footprint of a state highway project, one that required clear-cutting a corridor of timber 10 miles wide, right through the middle of that same forest. The surveyors weren't documenting an environmental disaster. They were just doing their jobs. But 2 centuries later, that's exactly what their numbers reveal. That wasn't the last secret hiding in this paperwork. In Iowa, township surveys conducted between 1832 and 1859 sketched in the earliest wagon trails, the spring settlers depended on, and the rough footprints of the first pioneer cabins. But they also recorded the locations of Native American villages, agricultural fields, and burial mounds, some of which were plowed under within a single generation. A surveyor jotting down the location of a burial mound in the 1840s had no way of knowing it would be leveled for a cornfield a few years later. But his notes are often the only reason anyone today knows it was ever there at all. Multiply that single burial mound by thousands of similar entries scattered across dozens of townships, and you start to see what these field books really are, a quiet, accidental census of a world that had almost no other way of being remembered. Preserving that census hasn't been easy. Many of these original plats are so fragile now that a single careless unfolding could destroy them. The University of Iowa has digitized over 1,600 of them, scanning each one at 600 pixels per inch just to buy the paper a little more time before it finally gives out. If Indiana's forests showed how paperwork could preserve an ecosystem, what happened next in Oregon revealed something far more unsettling, that the same grid could erase a living culture while it was still very much alive. The first Oregon Survey Office opened in 1851, tasked with mapping nearly 33 million acres. That land wasn't empty. It was home to Kalapuyan-speaking peoples, whose valley population had once numbered around 20,000. For generations, they had shaped that valley through controlled burning, keeping it an open mosaic of oak groves and grassland that produced camas root and acorns, a managed, cultivated landscape tended deliberately for centuries, though the surveyors never once used a word like farming. 2. The survey grid was laid directly over that living landscape at almost the exact moment it was being legally reassigned. Picture it plainly, a family that had tended the same oak grove for generations, harvesting the same acorns their grandparents harvested, watching a stranger walk through with a chain and a compass, marking that grove as section corners on a map meant to hand it to someone else entirely. Under the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850, a single settler could claim 320 acres, a married couple could claim 640, and in an unusual twist for the era, half of that married claim had to be registered in the wife's name, making it one of the earliest federal laws letting American women hold real estate outright. But here's the detail that's easy to miss. Every one of those grants legally depended on something happening first, the extinguishing of native title. Treaties, cessions, displacement. Within a few years of that survey grid going down, most of the Kalapuya had been removed from the Willamette Valley entirely, relocated to reservations far from the oak groves their families had tended for generations. The paperwork of opportunity for one family was, quite literally, built on the paperwork of dispossession for another. That pattern kept repeating as the system spread. In Texas, which kept control of its own public land rather than joining the federal system, surveyors drew thousands of maps by hand, and some of them filled the margins with small, almost whimsical illustrations that had nothing to do with property law at all. One of those draftsmen later abandoned cartography completely and became one of America's most widely read short story writers. Today, the Texas General Land Office holds more than 35 million land grant records and roughly 80,000 hand-drawn maps, a collection that isn't funded directly by the state at all and survives instead on grants, donations, and the sale of reproductions. That's how close some of this almost simply crumbled to dust in a filing cabinet. And by the early 20th century, the federal government had built entire divisions just to speed up this process on tribal land. One of them, managing the paperwork behind the 1887 Dawes Act, broke up communally held reservations into individual allotments, then sold off whatever land was left over as surplus. Its own map collection includes over 1,200 plats of Indian reservations, drawn between 1904 and 1931, each one a legal instrument for fragmenting land that had once belonged, whole, to a nation. The same division's files also cover abandoned military posts, old bounty land warrants, and railroad grants stretching into Arizona and New Mexico. An entire bureaucratic map of how the government converted shared land into private paperwork, one signature at a time. So by the 20th century, this same system, grid lines, witness trees, section corners, had done two things at once. It had displaced people again and again from Oregon to Indian Territory, and it had, without meaning to, built an accidental archive of exactly what existed before that displacement happened. That archive is what let researchers uncover something remarkable in coastal California. Around Tamales Bay, the standard historical account said, Coast Miwok communities had effectively disappeared after Spanish missionization. Franciscan missions had resettled and consolidated native populations decades earlier, and when a Russian trading outpost nearby finally closed in 1841, most written histories simply stopped mentioning Coast Miwok life in the area altogether, as if the story had quietly ended there. But when archaeologists began stacking Mexican-era sketch maps on top of early American coast surveys and land office plats, a different picture emerged. Many Coast Miwok families had, in fact, kept living on their ancestral land well into the American period. Their households had simply become invisible in the archaeological record because they'd adopted the same mass-produced tools and materials as their non-native neighbors. Only by layering those old maps, decade by decade, could researchers find exactly where those households had stood and start digging in places the written record insisted weren't even there. Without those maps, archaeologists would have been searching a coastline for a needle that history had already declared didn't exist. With them, they found broken ceramics, tool fragments, and household foundations sitting exactly where the overlapping plats said they should be, quiet, physical proof that an entire chapter of the official record had simply been wrong. That's the pattern running under this entire story: paperwork built to divide land, price it, or eliminate a community from it, becoming, almost as an accident, the only lasting proof that community ever existed. And nowhere does that pattern turn more painful than in the reservoirs that drowned entire towns on purpose. By the 20th century, these maps weren't recording old boundaries anymore. They were recording the final days of towns that were still very much alive. Boston's water needs had outgrown its supply, and in 1927, Massachusetts authorized the condemnation of the entire Swift River Valley to build the Quabbin Reservoir. Before a single home came down, surveyors and appraisers documented every structure in Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott, down to the last outbuilding. Barns, sheds, chicken coops, even the exact placement of stone walls between neighboring farms. Their work survives today in county valuation records, page after page of ordinary front yards, mapped with the same precision once used to carve up wilderness a century earlier. Then came the clearing crews. Buildings were razed, wrecked, or burned. Some cellar holes were filled in. Others were simply left open to the weather. A few structures were saved by relocation. A church moved to another town entirely. A golf clubhouse left standing on what would become an island, the only building still standing inside the reservoir today. And there was one task no valuation map could make routine. 13 historic cemeteries had to be emptied. Roughly 7,500 graves were exhumed and reburied before the water could reach them. Families who had already lost their homes now watching their dead dug up and moved as well, so that the reservoir wouldn't simply drown them where they lay. 2 dams sealed the valley in 1935. It took 7 years for the reservoir to fill completely, which meant the valley didn't vanish all at once. For years, families could still walk roads that legally no longer existed, watching the water creep a little closer every season. Today, Quabbin supplies unfiltered drinking water to nearly 7 million people. Satellites now track its forested watershed from orbit, watching the tree cover that quietly filters the water before it ever reaches a tap in Boston. A level of monitoring nobody surveying Dana's front porches in the 1930s could have imagined. But the town common of Dana sits just above the waterline. Cellar holes, stone fence posts, and granite steps still visible among the trees added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2013. Hikers now use digital mapping tools to walk those old roads and match an empty clearing to the exact family that once called it home. That wasn't the last time paperwork outlived a town. If you're finding these hidden threads of American history as compelling as I am, there's a lot more of this ahead. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where it leads next. Because in Tennessee, the same basic sequence played out again just a few years later for a completely different reason, not water, but electricity. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created in 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, to bring power and flood control to one of the poorest regions in the entire country. A valley where most rural homes still had no electricity at all, and where a single federal dam promised to change that, almost overnight. Its first major project, the Norris Dam, required purchasing more than 152,000 acres and displacing 801 families at a cost of just over $32 million. A staggering sum for a region still climbing out of the Depression. Among the communities lost was Loyston, a small Appalachian trading town of roughly 70 residents by the early 1930s, with 2 general stores, a filling station, a cafe, a barber shop, a grist mill, and a church that doubled as the schoolhouse. A handful of its homes and businesses even ran on their own small private power system, a rare comfort for a town its size. Before the valley was cleared, the TVA didn't just survey Loyston's land, it surveyed its people, conducting sociological studies of the families who lived there, interviewing them about their habits, their incomes, their attachments to the place, as if the government wanted a complete portrait of a community right before erasing it. A documentary photographer spent the town's final months capturing daily life before the flooding, one of the only visual records of a community that would soon exist only as the Loyston Sea, the name locals still use for that stretch of water today. Over 5,000 graves had to be relocated. A separate earthen dike had to be built just to stop the rising reservoir from spilling sideways into a valley that was never meant to flood at all. Not every family simply disappeared into the reservoir's shadow either. Some resettled a few miles south and founded a new community, naming it New Loyston, as if a name could survive even when the place itself couldn't. And a short drive from the old town site, a small state park museum still displays artifacts pulled from the valley, while a separate living history museum has reassembled entire buildings rescued from the flood zone, piece by piece, as if daring the reservoir to actually finish the job. That still wasn't the worst way a promise about land could be broken. Notice what's happening across both of these stories. Different states, different reasons, one for drinking water, one for electricity. But the same bureaucratic rhythm: measure it, price it, clear it, flood it. Different decades, different agencies, and yet almost the same paperwork, almost the same sequence of forms, almost the same quiet erasure dressed up as progress. And at least in both of these cases, families were paid something, however inadequate, and given time to leave. That wasn't true everywhere. In 1794, 50 Seneca sachems sat down with Timothy Pickering, a representative of President George Washington, and signed the Treaty of Canandaigua. It wasn't a vague gesture of goodwill. It named specific boundaries, in specific terms, and in it, the United States government made a direct, written promise regarding Seneca land that it would never claim the same nor disturb it. That promise held for over a century and a half. Then, in the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed the Kinzua Dam on the Allegheny River to protect downstream cities like Pittsburgh from flooding. The reservoir it would create was set to submerge roughly 10,000 acres of the Seneca Nation's own reservation, land explicitly protected by that 1794 treaty. The Seneca Nation didn't accept this quietly. They commissioned an independent engineer, Arthur Morgan, to design an alternative, the Conewango-Cattaraugus Plan, which would have diverted floodwaters into Lake Erie instead, providing the same flood protection without touching a single acre of Seneca land. They brought their case directly to two U.S. presidents, Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy, with public support behind them, and for a moment it looked like the plan might actually work. None of it mattered. Federal courts ruled in a case that would carry the plain, bureaucratic title of United States versus 21,250 acres of land that the government's power of eminent domain overrode the treaty entirely. A promise written down in 1794, honored for 150 years, was set aside by a lawsuit named after an acreage total instead of a person. Construction went ahead between 1960 and 1965. At a cost of over $108 million, more than 3 times what Norris Dam had cost a generation earlier, for a project whose own alternative the government simply chose not to use. The reservoir displaced more than 600 Seneca families and erased entire communities that don't appear on most modern maps at all, because there was nothing left to mark once the water rose. One section of that land, known as the Corn Planter Tract, sat so low it flooded most years already, and by the early 1950s it was nearly deserted. In part because the Seneca had refused to connect it to the regional power grid, and because the roads in and out were unreliable at best. Families who stayed had to raise their furnaces several feet off the ground, just to keep them dry through an ordinary spring. Here's where this story does something it hasn't done yet. It turns the very tool that caused the loss into the tool that partially undoes it. Decades later, the Seneca Nation's own mapping team set out to reconstruct exactly what had been erased, using nothing but old film and patience. The process is almost forensic. A researcher lines up a black and white aerial photograph taken just before construction against a modern digital map, corrects for decades of film distortion and warping, then traces the reservoir's known floodline, 1,365 feet, across both images at once. Wherever a rooftop appears above that line in the old photograph, and open water sits there today, that's a homestead confirmed. Not by memory, not by story alone, by 2 images taken 60 years apart, matched pixel for pixel. The same tool that helped erase a community became, generations later, the tool that proves exactly what that community looked like. A small, quiet form of justice, no court ruling ever provided. Kinzua wasn't the only place on a river where a dam silenced something that had lasted far longer than the United States itself. 14 miles upstream from the Dallas, Oregon, the Columbia River once dropped through a horseshoe-shaped stretch of basalt cliffs called Celilo Falls. People had fished there for at least 11,000 years, using wooden platforms built out over the churning water, netting salmon as they leapt the rapids. By some estimates, it was the oldest continuously inhabited community anywhere on the North American continent. In 1855, the United States signed treaties with the Yakima, Warm Springs, and Umatilla peoples guaranteeing their right to fish there at all usual and accustomed places. Language. A federal court would later confirm was never extinguished, even after everything that followed. What followed was the Dallas Dam. Construction began in 1952, justified by wartime power demand and a catastrophic 1948 flood that had destroyed a nearby town called Vanport. On March 10, 1957, the Army Corps of Engineers closed the dam's floodgates. 10,000 people gathered on the bluffs to watch. 4.5 hours later, the falls were gone, the fishing platforms submerged, the ancient village of Celilo underwater. The government paid the affected tribes close to $27 million in compensation. What it could not pay for was the sound. Witnesses that day said the roar of the falls, audible for miles for thousands of years, simply stopped. Here's the twist nobody expects. In 2007, on the dam's 50th anniversary, the Army Corps of Engineers went back with sonar and surveyed the riverbed where the falls used to be. The scan matched almost exactly the shape of the falls in photographs taken before the flooding. The falls are still down there, intact, waiting. A modern survey confirmed it. The same kind of technical, unglamorous document that, in every other story tonight, has been the thing quietly preserving what everyone assumed was gone for good. But not every disappearance in this story required a government decision at all, or a lawsuit, or even a single human choice. Sometimes the land simply made up its own mind and moved faster than any surveyor could keep up with. Kaskaskia, Illinois, was founded in 1703 as a French Jesuit mission and grew into a major colonial trading hub, sitting on a narrow strip of land between the Mississippi and Kaskaskia rivers, a location so strategically valuable, sitting at the junction of two major waterways, that whoever controlled it effectively controlled trade through the entire region. By the Revolution, it was significant enough that George Rogers Clark seized it in a surprise campaign against the British, a victory still remembered as a turning point on the western frontier. It became the first capital of Illinois in 1818, home to nearly 7,000 people at its peak, a genuine city, not a village, sitting on a strip of land that was slowly, invisibly, running out of time. Its downfall wasn't a reservoir or a treaty, it was cordwood, and almost nobody at the time would have believed that. Steamboat traffic exploded on the Mississippi through the 1800s, and every boat needed fuel for its boilers. Logging crews stripped the forests along the riverbanks to feed them, and without roots to hold the soil, the banks began eroding faster and faster. The river grew wider, shallower, and increasingly unstable, a slow-motion transformation nobody in Kaskaskia had any reason to connect to the wood being cut miles upstream. Then, during a major flood in April of 1881, it broke through the narrow strip of land separating it from the Kaskaskia River entirely, rerouting its main channel to the east and swallowing the old town site, including the original statehouse, for good. What was left of Kaskaskia became an island, cut off from the rest of Illinois, though the state boundary line technically never moved. To this day, Kaskaskia remains politically part of Illinois while sitting physically on the Missouri side of the river, its handful of residents reachable only by a single bridge, a state capital, on paper, that you can only reach by leaving the state first. The river wasn't finished making its point, either. During the Great Flood of 1993, the small community still clinging to Kaskaskia Island was evacuated entirely, under more than 9 feet of water, the same ground that had already outlived its own statehouse drowning a second time. Historians have since matched an 1875 survey of the town against modern satellite imagery, tracing the precise spot where a state capital once stood, now permanently underwater. That wasn't the strangest ending in this story either. At least Kaskaskia had the decency to stay hidden. One town, out in the Nevada desert, refused to. In 1865, a small group of Mormon settlers, sent out by Brigham Young, founded a farming town called St. Thomas at the point where the Muddy River meets the Virgin River. They believed, quite reasonably, that they were settling inside Utah territory, or possibly Arizona. They built homes, planted cotton and grain, and paid their taxes and tithes accordingly for years. Then, in 1870, a federal boundary survey came through and delivered an answer nobody in St. Thomas wanted to hear. The line on the map had been wrong the entire time. St. Thomas wasn't in Utah or Arizona. It had been sitting inside the state of Nevada all along, a mistake in an earlier survey that had gone uncorrected for years, until a new team of federal surveyors, doing nothing more dramatic than rechecking old coordinates, quietly rewrote which government the town actually belonged to. Suddenly, the town owed years of back taxes to a state it hadn't even known it belonged to. Rather than pay it, most of the town simply packed up and left in 1871. An entire community abandoned not because of a flood, a dam, or a treaty, but because of a single corrected line on a survey map. St. Thomas didn't stay empty for long, though. Settlers drifted back within a few years, and by the early 20th century, it had grown into a proper farming town along a major desert highway with a school, several stores, and a population that eventually passed 500. Then, in the 1930s, engineers finished Hoover Dam downstream on the Colorado River, and the reservoir it created, Lake Mead, began backing up the Virgin River Valley exactly the way the Swift River Valley had backed up in Massachusetts a few years earlier. The government purchased the land beneath St. Thomas, and the town emptied out for a second time in its short history. The very last resident, a man named Hugh Lord, is said to have refused to leave until the rising water reached his own front porch, then rode away from his house by boat, watching the roof disappear behind him. St. Thomas slipped beneath Lake Mead in 1938, fully submerged, seemingly gone for good this time. For over 60 years, that was the end of the story. Then, the desert did something almost nobody expected. Beginning in the early 2000s, a prolonged drought across the Colorado River Basin caused Lake Mead's water level to drop, year after year, far faster than anyone had planned for. And as the reservoir shrank, St. Thomas began to reappear. Building foundations, a cracked concrete swimming pool, the stone walls of an old ice cream parlor, fence posts still standing in rows, exactly where a 19th century survey plat once said a property line should be. A rusted car frame, half buried in dried lakebed mud, sitting roughly where a driveway used to be. Today, visitors to Lake Mead National Recreation Area can walk an actual marked trail through the ruins of a town that the government once believed it had erased permanently underwater. It's the only place in this entire story where you don't need a satellite image or a LiDAR scan to see a vanished settlement. You can just walk into it. 5 disappearances now. A reservoir built for drinking water. A dam built for electricity. A dam that broke a signed treaty. A river that made up its own mind. And a desert town, undone once by a corrected map and again by a dam, that the water itself eventually decided to give back. But every single one of them left behind the same kind of clue, a map made for taxation, compensation, engineering, or property law, that ended up being the only reason anyone could ever find these places again. None of the surveyors in this story set out to write history. They were doing a job, filling out forms, meeting a deadline set by an office that cared only about acreage and dollar value. And yet, this is so often how the most honest historical records get made. Not by someone trying to tell a story, but by someone just trying to finish the paperwork. That's also, quietly, why so much of this work is racing against time. Paper decays, ink fades, film curls and cracks. Every one of the archives in this story, the Texas maps, the Iowa plats, the Seneca aerial photographs, exists today only because someone, in the last few decades, decided it was worth scanning before it was too late. A few more years of delay in any of these cases, and there would be nothing left to overlay a satellite image onto at all. Modern researchers now routinely combine those old plats with LiDAR imagery, a laser scanning technology that can see through tree cover to the shape of the ground itself, hunting for the faint outline of a foundation that hasn't been visible in 100 years. The Seneca Nation uses this exact method to keep the memory of its lost communities alive on interactive digital maps, even though the physical places are gone. Hikers use the same principle at Quabbin, walking a shoreline and matching a grassy clearing to a name on a century-old valuation plat. And in California, the same layering of old maps that once hid Coast Miwok households is now the very method used to prove they never truly left. St. Thomas needed none of that technology at all. It's the one place in this story where the water simply changed its mind and handed the evidence back on its own, foundations and fence lines and all, a reminder that sometimes recovery doesn't take a satellite or a laser scan. Sometimes it just takes patience and a drought that lasts long enough. None of the institutions behind these maps set out to build a memorial. The General Land Office wanted revenue. Massachusetts wanted drinking water. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted flood control. Not one of them was thinking about the family that would, decades later, stand at a fence line with a printed map, trying to find the exact spot where a grandparent's kitchen once stood. And yet that's precisely what these documents now make possible. Somewhere, a descendant of a family from Dana or Loyston can still open a modern map, place a finger on an empty patch of forest or open water, and say with total certainty, "That's where our house stood." Not because they remember it. Many never saw it at all. But because a surveyor working for the very government that was about to take it from them wrote the coordinates down anyway and never imagined anyone would need them again 100 years later. For the Seneca Nation, still fighting today to protect what remains of their land, these maps aren't a historical curiosity. They're evidence. Proof of exactly where a promise was broken, drawn to scale, dated, and signed. Somewhere beneath a quiet reservoir, a front porch, a stone wall, or the foundation of a family home still lies exactly where it always did. The map is the only reason we know where to look. If this kind of forgotten history, the kind hiding inside old paperwork, nobody thought to look at twice, is something you want more of, subscribe to Forgotten Echoes, and I'll see you in the next one.